Welcome to Global Development Interrupted. If you have ever wondered what global development actually did for the world and the United States, you are in the right place. Today's guest is Marian Ostertag, a former USAID Foreign Service officer who spent her career working on food security and agriculture, the systems that shape stability, economies, and daily life far beyond the countries where USAID worked. We talk about why food matters, why pigs are a national security issue, and why Paraguay keeps coming up. So let's get into it and meet Marian. Hi, Marian. Welcome to Global Development Interrupted.
Hi, Leah. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm very excited for you to be here because I'm very excited to talk about agriculture. But before we start, can you give us your full name, where you are currently seated, and what was your last role at USAID?
Great. Yeah, my name's Marian Ostertag, and I am seated in my home office in Portland, Oregon. My most recent role before USAID shuttered was an ag development officer, and I sat in the Bureau of Resilience, Environment, and Food Security.
All right. Well, before we get into it, there is the ever present fun fact question. So, what was your go to fun fact that you used at USAID?
I guess probably what impressed people strangely is that I was a competitive ski racer growing up, and I ended up being a ski coach for a while when I was in college.
It's kind of like the Jamaican bobsled team.
Totally. A little bit in the reverse, though, instead of becoming like a bobsledder from Jamaica, I became a ski racer that worked in tropical agriculture.
But when you think about your background, where you grew up, your family, schools, is there something that pointed you in the direction, or do you think it was sort of a slow trajectory?
Yeah, when I was a little kid, I lived in a small mountain town, and my third grade teacher took a trip to Jamaica, and she spent her summer there, and she made all these connections with these rural kids, and we ended up having a long distance correspondence. And it was really eye opening to me to be a little kid in the United States and learn about the experience of a little kid in Jamaica and, what they had and what they didn't have and what the kind of life they had. And then another teacher at the school had been a Peace Corps volunteer. And I thought that it would be a great thing to do for your life to be a Peace Corps worker. And so for the longest time, from the time I was about 8 years old, I just said, what do you want to do when you grow up? Oh, I want to work for the Peace Corps. So that was kind of the start of it. And then over the years, I actually had the fortunate experience to have several teachers who had been Peace Corps volunteers. My high school history teacher had been a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay. And I had some college professors that also had Peace Corps experience. So, it was just sort of this point of these great mentors that I had and great people that really inspired me and that shared my values and that recognized that the world was big and there was lots to learn and then also lots to do. After college, I joined the Peace Corps, and I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nicaragua.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I also will have to say, I feel like Paraguay haunts me
Uh-huh.
because I met this man who was Nigerian. So we're talking, and he was like, yes, I'm either going to become a rapper or I will go to Paraguay and make blocks,
Oh.
big cement blocks. He's like, I will go to Paraguay and make blocks. And so I've always been like, what is this thing with Paraguay and blocks? And for some reason, I always run into people who have stories about Paraguay, and I'm like, tell me about the block industry.
Uh-huh. Well, so Paraguay also looms large in my experience from USAID
Hmm.
in that when I joined USAID, I was assigned to Paraguay. And I was so excited. And then uh, the wiser folks at the agency questioned the directed assignment to Paraguay because at the time Paraguay had a very, very small budget and they didn't really have much work in agriculture, despite the fact that Paraguay is a big agricultural country and they have a lot of trade with the United States and they produce a bunch of soy.
But the industry is really in blocks.
Totally in blocks. But they pulled my assignment and they reassigned me to Bangladesh,
Which we're going to find out later was great.
it was
But
great. But at the time, it was a total heartbreak, but it ended up being fantastic and amazing. But it was very interesting. And then the other thing about Paraguay, to bring it full circle, in this last bid cycle, my family, we were supposed to move to Paraguay in June. So I was going to finally achieve the goal and I was going to work on Paraguay. And then the doors shuttered.
But you did get to start your international experience with Nicaragua, which is an incredible country.
It really, really, really is, and that's actually what brought me to USAID also, because as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nicaragua, which is very interesting now when we think about, US interventions in places, Nicaragua has a long storied history of US intervention there, a complex history, currently also complex geopolitical
Hmm.
place. But I was there and it was just amazing. And it was a really interesting place to be a volunteer because I lived in a rural village up in the mountains. I was working on agriculture and food cooperatives and seed banks and 4-H clubs, you name it. There was a whole host of activities I was involved in. But the thing that was so interesting to me was as I was going down there, because of the history of U.S. intervention there up, all through the 70s and 80s during their revolution, I was convinced that Nicaraguans were going to be very
Hostel.
hostile, standoffish, critical of me, thinking that I'm a CIA agent or, the long arm of the American empire. But what I found is that the folks in Nicaragua, frankly, because they had experienced such political turmoil, they recognized there was a distinct difference between individuals and the government that they were part of. And so that human to human interaction that I had with the people in Nicaragua and the trust and the love that grew in my relationships with people in the little village I lived in and in the region was just so profound that I recognized the fact that despite political ideology, when we work hand in hand with people to achieve what their goals are, just great things can happen. And the trappings of geopolitical conflict and the strife of complex histories, government political histories, all that falls away when you can really make close relationships with people in the country. And then while I was there, I worked on a small USAID funded project, part of my which was the opening for understanding what USAID did. And then I said, okay, this is it. I'm gonna try to do this eventually. Several years later, almost a decade after that, grad school and lots of research and other different experiences, I joined USAID.
I was just, doing a little research before talking to you, and I was like, agricultural policy. What is this agricultural diplomacy policy? And it immediately referenced in my research, I went straight to the Marshall Plan,
Right,
which was the plan after World War II to help bring Europe back, reconstruct Europe so they could be stable partners for economy and security. And
right.
the big focus was agriculture and essentially modernizing agriculture and making sure that Europe had a stable source of food and other things. But what I also found fascinating is that arc has continued. So from the Marshall Plan, there's been other initiatives that have gone forward, but one of the main ones that started in 2010, and correct me if I'm wrong,
No, you're exactly right.
is the Feed the Future initiative, which
Yep.
was then looking at food insecurity and resiliency and how do we move from food gifting to creating strong systems and programs for food value chains. And you were part of that.
Yes, yes, I was. That was the whole time, my whole tenure at USAID was under Feed the Future. And it was a really remarkable presidential initiative that started under Obama. But then every subsequent president supported it. And actually, they ended up, Congress, with bipartisan support, codified it into law. So it wasn't just an initiative, it ended up becoming something that we were going to fund in perpetuity because the returns on the investment for agricultural work were so great that they thought that this should continue until it needed to be revisited at some point. But to your point, the lessons learned from stabilizing food security post World War II in Europe gave us a lot of knowledge about when countries have stable food sources and when people can access and afford health, safe, and nutritious food, they can focus their energies on other activities and doing economic interventions, and it improves health, it improves political tranquility, frankly. When you have a well-nourished population, people are healthy, they attend school more, they are less likely to migrate, which all of these sorts of things that are key cornerstones to some of the challenges that we're facing right now in the United States are addressed through food security. What's more, there's this idea that USAID was just giving food around the world, but the USAID the Future initiative really worked at helping countries develop systems for food production, local food production, appropriate food that was culturally responsive to what people ate in their countries, and agricultural industries to create economic engines for economic growth and for health and wellness of their population. So it was, you know, when I first joined Peace Corps, when I was joining Peace Corps, it's interesting. They asked me, do you want to be a youth development volunteer? Do you want to be a health volunteer? Or do you want to be an agriculture volunteer? And I was talking to a few friends of mine and I'm like, I'm not really sure. I probably have the most experience in youth, but I was thinking about the complexity of being a Peace Corps volunteer and the geopolitical, ideas of going into another country. And what really resonated with me was the idea that food is a basic human need. And anyone that helps someone feed themselves, that's not a political act. That's a act of empowerment. And no one will argue whether or not it's a good idea to help people feed themselves. It's across the board, across religious ideologies, across political ideologies, helping people develop systems so they can meet their basic human needs for food and food security. It just transcends all those things. And so dedicating my life to something like that seemed like this gift. So I did that. And then when Feed the Future happened and it was codified, it also seemed like we were doing the right thing because we weren't undermining local production systems. We were supporting local production systems. We were bringing technology from the United States to bear within the context of these emerging economies. US aid wasn't implementing Feed the Future just across the board. It was in these very specific selected countries that had the conditions, the market conditions, the political conditions, and the agroecological conditions that we could really make these catalytic interventions that would ultimately lead to sustainable food production in those countries. And that just seemed, across the board from an environmental perspective, a win, from a economic perspective, a win, from a political perspective, a win. And it was just a real treat to be able to spend some of my professional career working on something that was so effective and so needed and really so successful.
What's standing out to me is the point about addressing root causes
Hmm.
and creating sustainability within food systems and agriculture. You're reducing the amount of funding that would be going towards like acute problems, famine, severe malnutrition, as well
Right.
as then creating a stable trading partner.
One of the metrics, I mean, as you well know, USA was champions of measuring outcomes, but one of the critical and interesting metrics that we used was humanitarian assistance that didn't go to these places. So we would measure the effectiveness of interventions based on the ability to withstand shocks and stresses. So in the event that, a hurricane hit, or if there was a price shock, if and that which we experienced with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was price shock. So amount the amount of fertilizer available to the world went down and the price of it went up. So the cost of production around the world just went through the roof. And so that causes a humanitarian crisis for many, many places. But if you have a diversified stream of sources of fertilizer, fuel, food, etc., then you can mitigate those price shocks in a globalized production system. So those are the sorts of things that we were working on to not only stabilize these countries, but also stabilize US need to have these interventions in these countries as well. So it was penny wise, pound foolish choice to shut US aid, because now, as we've seen in Jamaica and in these other places, there's not the support, the long-term support from US aid to stabilize these things. And we're just going to see an ever escalation the need for humanitarian intervention in these places, which, is really unfortunate and actually going to be economically unsound, frankly.
Well, it's more expensive when you
Totally. That
do an intervention
economically
like that.
unsound. I should just cut to the chase and say, it is penny wise, pound foolish. We're going to be spending billions and billions of dollars more in humanitarian responses because we don't have the systems and the support in place to help communities and countries respond to shocks and stresses, environmental ones, political ones, and geopolitical ones. I mean, just for example, Venezuela. We had a activity in Venezuela, and it's very interesting because it's so heart-wrenching to see what is happening in Venezuela.
What's what's happening in Venezuela right now is the US has gone in and the Trump is saying now that we will control Venezuela. And there is a lot of controversy over what that means. Did he really mean that? And what are we doing in Venezuela? From your perspective, having worked there on a particular activity, you must have a lot of thoughts about what's happening in the country.
Venezuela is a very complex place, and the US had been working there for many, many, many years to support not the dictatorship of Maduro, but the people that were suffering under that dictatorship. And what is very interesting to me is that this approach that Trump has taken to just pluck out the leader doesn't actually address the root causes of the destabilization of that country. The Venezuelans themselves suffer from continued instability and continued lack of democratic representation.
You're not just talking with your FSO ag background, but the reason we keep saying Bangladesh is great is because you met your husband there in
Yes.
Bangladesh. And who and
Yeah,
wh where did he work?
so my husband worked at the Department of Defense in the Defense Attaché office, and it was a fascinating time to be in Bangladesh and working on food security because while I was there, I had so many opportunities to have interesting conversations with a whole host of different people from different agencies because we were all co-located at the embassy. So I had friends in the FBI and friends in the State Department and friends at USDA. And so we would sit down and have these conversations about our different perspectives on the similar situations that were happening in Bangladesh. And while I was in Bangladesh, there was several terrorist incidents, and there was the rise of ISIS in the Indian subcontinent.
So
And so
when were you in Bangladesh?
so I went to Bangladesh in 2016. And so it was an interesting time for me to learn all about the different agencies' perspective and how they were intervening and doing US government work abroad in an environment that was really focused on mitigating radicalization and stabilizing economies and fomenting a really close alliance with a government that maybe didn't necessarily see eye to eye with us on many, many issues. So my husband worked at my not my husband at the time, but this dashing young Department of Defense man who worked in the Defense SSA office, and I would have these conversations. And he pointed out that he would loved, as Donald Rumsfeld, it's funny to say, but as Donald Rumsfeld often said, he loved US aid because every dollar that US aid spent was $100, $1,000 that the Department of Defense wouldn't have to spend. And what's more, if we were successful in trying to stabilize economies, make food and healthcare and access to water and access to all the basic needs of a human, we would mitigate the need for military interventions and we could stabilize environments and stabilize communities so they would be less likely to radicalize. They would be less likely to migrate. And they would be less likely to engage in conflict. So all of the DoD colleagues that I had there were always champions. They said, anything you need, let us know. And there's been many, many cases of partnership between DoD and USAID on working on many things. Actually, my husband, after he retired from the military, he worked in the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance on civilian and military coordination on humanitarian responses. So it's a wonderful partnership. And it's something that I think if you ask many, many, many men and women in the military, they would tell you that it's a real shame that USAID has shuttered because it makes us not only more vulnerable as a country, but it makes the men and women serving more vulnerable to having to engage boots on the ground and spend much more DoD's budget on addressing these destabilizations in these environments where USAID had been for many years.
With that
On
end,
that happy note,
we're gonna switch to something even more fun.
okay.
Pandemics.
Okay, yes.
Because when people think about pandemics, I think often we think about, COVID-19. For
Right.
me, HIV and AIDS, right? health consequences for humans. But you had a very different view set because you were working on agricultural threats. And we spoke earlier, and you were talking a lot about pigs. So, why should we be concerned about agricultural threats in America? And why do pigs have a part in this?
Pandemics impact both animals, plants, and people. As we learned with coronavirus, they can be totally detrimental and devastating. Similarly, there's illnesses that run through plants and run through animals around the world. So USAID established an Ag Threats Working Group, and it was a group of technical experts, veterinarians, plant pathologists, other folks that monitored the emergence of animal and plant diseases around the world. One of them that happened right fairly recently was African swine flu, which is a disease that is completely decimates swine populations, showed up in the island of Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic, and Haiti. And it affected all of the pigs on the entire island. And so, you may be thinking here up in the Northwest, okay, why is that my problem? Too bad, so sad. Sorry that the pigs are dying out there in the Caribbean. But what you don't necessarily think about is the nexus between illnesses in the Caribbean and the potential impact that they can have on the U.S. swine industry, which is a $3 billion industry. So a huge, huge industry and a great source of food for people in our entire country. And if any of those infected pigs got to the United States, or if there was a human vector or a plant vector or some sort of transmission of that disease to the United States, it would have very rapidly disseminated through all of the pigs in the United States. And we would have had a price shock for bacon. And it would have had a dramatic economic impact on the day-to-day purchases of Americans around our whole country. So we luckily had an intervention. We worked with the governments of Haiti. We worked with the governments of the Dominican Republic. We worked with a whole host of U.S. partner agencies, USDA, the State Department, and we were able to mitigate the spread of that disease through some really aggressive uh, campaigns, education, eradication. They did some culling. Were it not for the rapid and effective response of the U.S. government, more than likely it would have made it to the United States. And that the vulnerability that we have in agricultural production in the United States can't be overemphasized. We live in a globalized world, and there's trade and there's commerce, and boats are coming and going, things are arriving, people are moving, and with that comes these illnesses. So it's really important for us to have engagement in these places to mitigate the transmission of these diseases and illnesses, and to help the countries where they emerge treat them there so they don't become problems for ourselves or other countries in the region. And as we saw, if with the pandemic, I think that experience has brought to light just our vulnerability as people to, without having systems in place to mitigate the spread of diseases, it really can have a dramatic impact on our life. So I think it's a real shame, again, that USAID isn't able to work and monitor these things because, as the climate changes, we anticipate, and all ag scientists and climate scientists will tell you this, we anticipate that there's going to be more and more emergence of new plant and animal diseases. And so by not having the technical experts monitor and work on these things, we're going to see more and more dramatic impacts of them. And we'll see those dramatic impacts in our day-to-day lives, even here in the United States.
Yeah, I am finding with our conversation, there's a real thorough line with the price shocks for Americans. You spoke
Yeah,
of the Ukraine invasion by Russia
right.
increasing the cost of fertilizer, and that affects the world, that affects American agricultural economy.
Yes.
You have talked about if African swine fever had hit the United States, the economic impact of that on the ability for people to buy food. There's this thorough line of what happens in other countries is going
Right.
to affect the United States.
Yeah, we live in a globalized economy, and the food system that we are a part of is a globalized one. And so to think that we can just, you know, turn off our engagement as other countries is not true. And we will start seeing the impacts of that because prices will go up and there will be more illnesses and there'll be shocks and we'll see all of these fluctuations and they'll because we're not mitigating them at the source, we will start seeing higher, you know, price shocks that impact your own pocketbook on a day-to-day basis just when you go to the grocery store.
Well,
And
you know
I
what
know
I'm thinking of? I'm
what?
thinking of eggs.
Right. I was just gonna say that. Like, when the avian
Flu?
flu decimated the entire populations, you couldn't get eggs. Those sorts of things, I think, are gonna become more prevalent. Similarly, there's other illnesses, there's rice rust, there's so many illnesses, and we have to continuously engage in mitigating the spread of these illnesses that impact basic food items that the world depends on. Normally, when you have a globalized food supply chain, if there's something happening in one place, you can source from another place. But with some of these illnesses, they spread to all of the crops across the world. And then we see huge shocks in the prices and the availability, which ends up causing food shortages and price spikes in these places, which again destabilizes these, vulnerable or fragile environments. And it's just one of the things that what Feed the Future was really addressing, and I'm just sad to see that, that work isn't continuing.
I know, because here I am complaining about eggs, but in other countries, it can create incredible famine.
Of course, and it does, and it has, and it will even more so, unfortunately.
So, Marion, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about the threat of pandemics. We've talked about feed the future and the loss of creating stable systems, and then military interventions in our security. But when you think about all of what we've just talked about or beyond, what is the thing that worries you the most with, the removal of USAID and the step back around global assistance?
I think for me, the saddest thing, I'm not sure it's the most critical, but for me on a personal level, the saddest thing is I just think about the loss of that mutual understanding, the person to person connection, and the relationships that we've built with partner countries, partner staff, with all of these country governments that worked in partnership with us. And I feel like the human to human connection and interaction was sort of the best face of the United States, and it was the richest and the most meaningful part of the work that I did. And to have that go away makes both the world lonelier and it makes me really sad. And it feels like we're ushering in this sort of meaner, bullyish, misunderstanding approach to our engagement internationally, which I don't think is good for us and I don't think it's good for anyone else. And that's really, frankly, the saddest part of it for me.
For Americans that feel a bit disconnected from this,
Right.
what do you wish they understood about why the removal of USAID and the step back from global assistance affects them?
Well, I just think, all the things we've talked about with the military interventions, I think we're going to see an escalation of putting men and women in harm's way. We're going to spend more money on defense interventions. I think you're going to see more price shocks in the global food supply. I think we're going to see more animal and plant illnesses impact US production. I think we're going to see increases in migration from vulnerable environments. Like if people can't eat and have economic opportunities, they will leave. And we'll see, despite the policies of the government, people will make their way here. And I think we will be looked on less as a world power and a world leader and more as a self interested country that's not interested in a leadership role, which is really not actually a position of power.
When you think about what has to happen going forward, what do you see as a good pathway for the United States?
I mean, let me count the ways. No, there are so many opportunities to right the ship. There are basic interventions that we could do that would respond to emergent needs from countries. Oftentimes, there's a, a leader in USAID at REFS, Resilience, Environment, and Food Security Bureau, and he would always say, "Don't let a crisis go underutilized. So sometimes when we and if we engage with countries in a crisis situation and we do the right thing, that's a great opportunity to build trust. So, for example, if there are additional humanitarian crises, if there is a new administration that has a perspective that's different than the current one, where we're interested in leveraging the capacity and expertise of partner governments again, we could engage and help support them in their time of need and start repairing those relationships. There are enough people that are still in our partner governments that understand the context of what we're doing. It will take time and energy and effort, but we can do it because there also are so many people that really understand the complexity of the global environment that we're in that could continue to engage and should. But I think if we do it in a thoughtful way and if we do it in a moment where we actually help a country achieve what they want to do, we could build trust again. The United States is still, a fairly young country, but a long history, and we've had lots of pivots and lots of changes and haven't always done the right thing. Yet, you know, what's the MLK quote? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it always bends towards justice.
What I like to say about that is it bends, but pound it. Pound it towards justice. You can't just
Yeah,
let
it
it do
won't
it
go
by
on its own.
itself.
It's not like a gravitational pull. People have to engage. People have to demand it. We have to take action. So the thing about it is, I feel like I mean, it's interesting because my husband, once he got let go from USAID, he went back to school and he's going to become an elementary school teacher. After his military career, after working at USAID, he feels like he wants to work with children to help them be engaged citizens, conscientious consumers of media, mutually respectful, and all the things that I feel like we're missing right now. I feel like there has to be a shift in representative democracy if we're going to have a change in this country. And I'm excited about working on that. And I'm hopeful that we see some changes in this next election cycle. And that's just what I have to hang my hat on. And my commitment is to not abandon the country, but double down my efforts in way that I can to bring it back. How can I help people understand what it means and what it is that we can do as citizens to help ourselves and help the world?
Exactly. And I love that your husband is gonna become an elementary school teacher because that's where it all starts. Youth.
It does. It does. And that's where, my path to USA happened from when I was a little kid. And I was just so lucky. And, I'm hopeful that the little kids that are in my husband's second grade class have similar experiences with him. And he talks about, all the 50 some odd countries that he's been to and lived in and the experiences that he's had and the work that he's done and the things that he's learned from other places and brings it back here to the United States. So despite everything, one of my favorite quotes is hope dies last. And I'm still alive and I'm still hopeful. So,
Beautifully said. Right. Well, before we end, is there
yes.
any specific story from your experience that impacted you or you think really brought meaning to your life that you want to share?
There's one activity when I was in Bangladesh. It was a women's empowerment and agriculture activity. And we went to southern Bangladesh to visit some of these farmers that were doing fish farming. And so in Bangladesh, mostly people have small plots of land. It's one of the densest countries in the entire world. So huge population. But most people live in these rural communities, and most everyone is a rice farmer and also a fish farmer in Bangladesh.
Can you explain
So,
why the two go together?
oh, fish farming and rice farming go together because what you use the sludge from the fish farms, you can use as fertilizer for the rice fields and vice versa. The waste products from rice production can be used in production of fish food. And so it's a symbiotic relationship and it can be done in a similar environment on a small scale. And we met a fish farmer and her name was Rashida. And she had been in a rough relationship with her husband, and she finally was able to leave him with the support of this USAID activity. And she had several small children, but she was so successful, and she had started fish farming on a little pond, and then she started producing fish and selling little fish to other people. And so she started a small business, not only of fish production, but providing fish inputs for other people. Talking to her and hearing about the story, just brought home how important some of the work is that we did. We're sending her kids to school and they otherwise wouldn't have gone to school. She was able to extract herself from what was a terrible environment. She wasn't like relying on gifts from USAID. It was a production system that she had had a few inputs supplied to her, and then she was providing those things to other people. So it was sort of again, a catalytic intervention that was making a change immediately in this person's life, but then she was making positive changes in other people's lives around her. It's just, those sorts of things that I saw again and again and again working in the work that I did at USAID was so powerful and so meaningful.
Well, I like this hopeful note that we're ending on. And I have a lot of hope for you in Paraguay.
Me too, maybe. I mean, at least I need to go on vacation there.
And when you head to Paraguay, let me know and I'll send you my block questions.
So I'll go out and talk to everybody and see about this block production.
Oh my
for
gosh.
you.
And what if you met my Nigerian man?
I would love that. I'm not shocked that it's a Nigerian man that planned to go to Paraguay. Of course, the creative ingenuity, entrepreneurial spirit of Northern Nigerians, I think, is unmatched in the world.
Thank you so much for joining me, Marian. This has been an excellent conversation. I've learned so much.
Good. Well, I have enjoyed it as well. Thanks for inviting me onto your podcast. It's been a pleasure.
This is Leah. If you enjoyed this episode, follow Global Development Interrupted wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe on Substack to get new stories and updates straight to your inbox. When you subscribe, you'll also get GDI Insights, short written reflections from people who built their careers in global development and public service. They reflect on the work, the disruption, and what they're carrying forward and what they want to see next. And remember to always like and follow. Until next time.